Donald Trump is going to be the 47th president of the United States.
We have seen one estimate that says it would cost $88 billion to deport 1 million people a year. Is that what American taxpayers should expect?
What price do you put on national security? Is that worth it?
The American people have spoken, and Donald Trump is going to be the 47th president of the United States. Judge Matt O'Brien, what does this mean in general for immigration policy, where we were and where we're going to go?
Well, I think what it means is that we're going to have a secure border once again. The big question is, how long is it going to take to clean up the mess that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris made?
It just seems like such a massive challenge because we've documented on here very clearly the damage you referenced. Where do you start? I mean, the border area is a mess. The interior is lawless. Where do you start?
Well, I think you start at the border. You start by telling all of the people that are there, I hear you knocking, but you can't come in. The problem under the Biden administration wasn't that the immigration laws weren't effective, like Biden kept telling everyone. It was that he was just disregarding them for his own purposes. So normally when people show up at the border and say, I want asylum, you don't just go, okay, and let them in and, wave them on by and let them go into the interior of the United States. Normally what you do is you try and find out if they're telling you anything that indicates they have a legitimate asylum claim and they're detained while that process goes on. So I think the first step is to restore control at the border, and then the second step is to send ICE out to start finding and removing people who broke the law to get here. And I would assume that's going to start with criminals because they're usually easier to find. If people have been convicted, there's usually some type of a court record or order of supervision or something that allows ICE to find them. And I think the other thing that will be key is going to be either identified or suspected national security threats. And that could be terrorists, it could be foreign spies, could be foreign military people.
Now, President-elect Trump has mentioned during the campaign about he wants to finish the wall. We remember from his first term, the Democrats fought him tooth and nail to get the funding required for it. Now he's got majorities in both houses of Congress. Is this going to be different this time? Is he going to be able to get what he needs to finish that?
Yeah, I think he's still going to get some resistance because there are certain, how should I put it, less than border security conscious members of his own party who probably won't be happy about the idea of a wall. But I think what you'll see is rapid construction of barriers this time around.
Another policy that Trump did in his first term that was really effective was the Remain in Mexico policy, whereby these people were not detained on the U.S. side of the border, but on the Mexican side. How likely is it that's going to be able to be reinstated, and how do you see that happening?
Well, I'm 100% certain that it's going to be reinstated because the case on that went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was Trump v. Hawaii, and the court was extremely deferential to the president in terms of the authority that Congress gave to the president to close down the border or to close the border to certain segments of the migrant population. So I think there's still going to be some pushback, but that is definitely going to go back into place. And any kind of lawsuits trying to stop it are likely to be 100% unsuccessful.
It seems like the election results were a huge validation of everything Trump has said about what he wants to do with immigration, because it's been the kind of central issue throughout his campaign, both now and previously. The opposition seems to have latched on to this mass deportation project as the point of attack that they're going to go after. How do you see that going down? How plausible is it to deport the kind of numbers that have been discussed?
Well, first of all, there's two things that contribute to this whole mass deportation myth. The first one is a deliberate attempt to try and align what's being done here to enforce the immigration laws of the United States humanely with what the Nazis did in Europe to the Jewish populations. But that was a different situation. Those were citizens who happened to be Jewish in places like France, Germany, Hungary, Romania, who were sent away because of who they were. The only distinction that's being made here is between United States citizens and people who aren't citizens. And the people who aren't citizens, there's a legitimate legal question of, do you have permission to be here? So that's part number one. Part number two is this sort of thing that comes from both the left and the right going, well, we don't have the political will or the resources to deport that many people. And, Mark Levin has done a couple of shows on this, and he said, well, how do we know? Because we haven't tried. That's just a fallback that takes the pressure off of politicians who don't want to handle this to not bother to try. So this time you have a group of people in charge who are motivated to do this. And, the mass deportation label is just silly because in any given year, even with somebody who's relatively open borders minded in the presidency, the United States deports upwards of 100,000 people. In the biggest years following the September 11th attacks, it was in the neighborhood of 450,000. So I think this is just a question of dedicating the resources to this, which has not been done in the past. Homeland Security has had a significant amount of funding, but the Congress never committed a sufficient amount of that to things like detention space for illegal aliens and removal flights for immigration violators of all kinds. So I think what you're going to see this time is a comprehensive plan for the logistics of this to be handled. And I mean, if the United States can put a man on the moon, we can certainly handle returning home a number of people who are uninvited guests here.
Even though they were completely rejected on Election Day, the other side is going to be undaunted and come after this, just like they did in the first Trump administration. How legally or any other way do you think they're going to come at this deportation project to try to slow it down?
Oh, they're going to claim all kinds of due process and civil rights violations. I mean, they'll get creative. They'll look at environmental law, and they'll find, weird provisions of all kinds of laws that really don't have anything to do with immigration, but they'll argue that they do. And, then another favorite tactic for folks on that side of the issue is to try and revisit things again, even though they're settled points of law. And of course, you see them getting very upset about things like this when they get reversed on other issues. And yet they think it's perfectly okay to do that on points of immigration law. So a lot of things that have been litigated, like 1182F, they're going to go forum shopping. They're going to go to sympathetic federal circuits in places like California and the Ninth Circuit. And they're going to ask for things that are already settled matters of immigration law to be changed. And the fact is, the district courts and the appellate courts in those places may very well try and find some perceived loophole or wiggle room and rule in favor of the no borders contingent. But those things are going to then progress to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court is going to point to the Trump v. Hawaii case and say, no can do. This is a faulty interpretation.
Deportation is something that the government does. It's within their purview. How are they going to make this claim? They're going to say that the federal government doesn't have the right to deport people here illegally?
Well, their plan all along, and what they've been doing as long as I've been involved in this business, is to try to portray deportation as a punishment. And when you stop and think about it, deportation is not a punishment. It's a restoration. You're taking a person that has no right to be in the United States, and you're returning them to the place where they have full political rights. So it's no different than evicting a tenant who hasn't paid the rent or who is squatting. And for some reason, the other side has managed to convince a lot of people who don't stop to think about what's going on in these cases that the fact that people like it here and that they have formed business and personal ties are equities, and that it then becomes unfair or somehow unlawful to remove them. But if you stop and think about it, that's like arguing that I stole your Cadillac or your Mercedes-Benz, and since I've grown very attached to it, and over time I've really come to enjoy how fast it goes and how plush and comfortable it is, that I shouldn't have to give it back to you and that I shouldn't be punished for stealing it. So the part of this that gets left out is I think there's been this tendency for the media and for a lot of the advocacy groups that advocate on behalf of migrants. They paint this picture that whenever somebody foreign comes to the border, they can either present a visa and appropriate travel documents and get permission from CBP to come in, or if they don't have any of that, they tell CBP, well, I don't have any of that, I want to come in. And CBP waves them in. And it's been portrayed as they have this choice between being an illegal alien or an undocumented person and being somebody who is here lawfully. And that's been muddied even further by the policies of the Biden administration. The fact is that you can't enter the United States without permission if you're not a United States citizen. If you do, you've committed a crime. It's 18 U.S.C. 1326, and 1325 and a couple of subsections have to do with criminal reentry. So if you come here and you don't have permission, it's both a civil offense, a violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and a criminal offense. And, that hasn't changed. It's just that many administrations, Republican and Democrat, have decided to ignore the parts of the Immigration and Nationality Act that they don't like in order to pander to perceived constituencies.
Now, as you might imagine, the corporate media is all on board with opposing this, and they started before the election trying to sway public opinion. However, more than half of the country is for mass deportation, as recent polls have shown. That's not going to stop them, though. They're putting this out there now. All these narratives that you were referencing. They started. It was about a week before the election. 60 Minutes interviewed Tom Homan, who's been early senior fellow for the last 4 years, now about to be Trump's border czar. And there were a number of clips in there that really revealed their agendas and how duplicitous the media can be. So we're going to take a look at one right now. This is a clip of Cecilia Vega, the 60 Minutes correspondent, interviewing Tom Homan, and let's see what she had to say.
We have seen one estimate that says it would cost $88 billion to deport 1 million people a year.
I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Is that what American taxpayers should expect?
What price do you put on national security? Is that worth it?
Is there a way to carry out mass deportation without separating families?
Of course there is. Families can be deported together.
Tom's line there at the end about families can be deported together, that's been made into a meme that's gone all over the world right now. But the point she raises about $88 billion, isn't that something of a pittance compared to the overall cost that illegal immigration is costing this nation?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that's a fake number that's been put out by the anti-borders contingent. I don't know if it would actually cost that much. But when I was at FAIR, we did a study tracking the cost of illegal immigration to U.S. taxpayers. And based on the information that we could get, it's between $150 and $160 billion a year with a B. So even if it cost $88 billion a year and say it took 5 years, you're still saving money because deporting these folks costs half what it costs to have them remain in the United States. So just as a simple mathematical problem, it winds up being a net savings for the American taxpayer. And I think the number is actually way bigger than $150 billion a year because there's a lot of things that you can't get information on that you can't necessarily account for that cost the taxpayer money. I mean, the other thing is the point Tom Homan made is 100% correct. The September 11th attacks were the result of a failure in immigration enforcement. It wasn't like the commission said a failure of imagination and intelligence. It was flat out a failure of immigration enforcement. Every single one of the 9/11 attackers are people that exploited loopholes in the legal immigration system to be here, and nobody was watching the store. So how much did that cost American taxpayers? And if we have another incident that, even costs half of that, then the price of removing these people in order to protect national security will have been well worth it.
We saw this during Trump's first term as well, when he wanted to complete the border wall. And I think they said the price tag was like $20 billion, I think it was. And the Democrats went crazy. This is outrageous. This is way too much money. We can't afford this. It's not going to work. The same people who spend money flagrantly on so many other wasteful things all of a sudden now are fiscal hawks, and they want to be penny pinching on this one thing that would actually deliver some security to this country. It's kind of strange, isn't it?
Well, I think the whole wall construction thing was an object lesson in how messed up the federal budgeting process and the federal contracting processes are. We also did a study on what it would cost to build and maintain a border wall, and we said that the initial construction, if I recall correctly, was somewhere in the like $20 to $22 billion range, and that it would probably cost a number of millions to maintain it every year. But if you look at that, again, that's a net savings. And I am not a fan of all these government gimmies and handouts. I'm a capitalist at heart. But the fact is that if we were not spending $150 billion a year on illegal aliens, that is, people who are not citizens of the United States and who in most cases aren't paying enough in taxes to cover the services that they consume, what could we do with that money? I mean, if you wanted to have universal payment for tuition for all American students, you could probably pay for it with that $150 billion a year that you save, particularly if you squirreled that away and put it in some kind of interest-bearing investment or something that makes money for the American public. So the commentary on this is just crazy. It's a deliberate attempt to create a red herring by exploiting sticker shock.
And if the anti-borders crowd wants to go down this road of fiscal responsibility, fine, let's do it. In that 60 Minutes piece, they also interviewed Jason Hauser. Remember him?
Yes.
When you testified on Capitol Hill, he was opposite you and testified that Alejandro Mayorkas was a stalwart advocate for the border agents. Remember that?
Yeah, that was ridiculous. But this is what happens when you take somebody who has no experience in immigration. As I understand, Hauser was a military guy, and I thank him from the bottom of my heart for his service. But having been a military guy doesn't mean you know anything about immigration or border control or how those things work. And this is what happens when you pull people in to the whole border issue that don't understand how it works, how it's supposed to work, and all of the different things that are tied up in that. And so he was up on the Hill testifying that Ali Mayorkas is the second coming of goodness, kindness, and sliced bread. And it just doesn't make any sense. Anybody who looked at video of the people who are rushing the National Guardsmen in Texas at the border, or who looked at the Haitians who were rushing the Border Patrol agents, where the Border Patrol agents then got unfairly tarred and feathered by Ali Mayorkas for whipping Haitian migrants, which never happened. A couple of things should become evident when you look at those. One, not everybody who's trying to get into the United States is nice. You and I did a whole podcast episode on the near riot that broke out when the Border Patrol closed the bridge. I mean, those are things that look like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. People who knew what they were doing and who ran the Department of Homeland Security correctly did not have things like that happening. Those are a common occurrence under Mayorkas. I've said it before, I'll say it again, he's a buffoon. And frankly, I think he should be making license plates rather than being in the position that he's in.
Right. It's very interesting, though, that 60 Minutes piece. I've got something coming out soon on that where I just dissected a lot of the angles they took, because it shows how the media is going to go after this against Trump. And they basically made Hauser the sensible government worker to oppose what they presented as this extremist Homan who was presenting mass deportation. Hauser's credibility was called into question in that congressional hearing you participated in. As you recall, Congressman Pat Fallon was grilling him, and he said, he quoted Biden, who said, "It's ridiculous how these migrants are being strapped." And he said, "Was anyone strapped, Mr. Hauser?" And he said, "Well, you'd have to check with CBP on that." So he can't even look with his own eyes and objectively state what is plainly obvious, that that was not taking place.
He doesn't want to look.
Yeah.
The narrative, the truth, interferes with the narrative that he's pushing. And the fact is, Ali Mayorkas, before he went out and held the press conference criticizing the Border Patrol agents, knew that that's not what happened, because it was later found out through emails that were released to the public that he had been emailed by someone who looked into it and I think had even conversed with the journalist who was there and saw it, and everybody told him, no, this didn't happen. So, Hauser is a partisan who's more interested in lionizing Ali Mayorkas, probably so that Hauser can continue to work in the kind of positions that he's been in. He's not interested in the truth, and that's problematic. And it's the same thing with this family separation thing. When you stop and look at this, the typical pattern for illegal migration to the United States has been, and until very recently, this was almost set in stone. A male member of the family would come here. After he acquired enough money from working illegally and under the table, he would send for the family. Now you see women coming with children, women leaving children behind, husbands and wives coming and leaving children behind. What separates families in these situations is the migrants' decision to separate the families. And nobody criticizes the migrants for that when they go off and leave family members at home. But somehow when we enforce the law to remove uninvited guests, and as an ancillary effect, that results in the separation of family members, this is supposed to be a problem. Meanwhile, as I've pointed out numerous times, and as Tom always points out when he's interviewed on this, if you're a U.S. citizen driving down the street out here, down Mass Avenue, with your child in the car and you're drunk and you get pulled over by the DCPD, guess what happens? You're going to be separated from your children. And that whole argument is, number one, a red herring, and number two, it's disingenuous, because what it is designed to do is convince people who don't know any better that what the Border Patrol or ICE is doing is unkind. It's not. It's just procedure. And when you become aware of the number of children that are encountered on the border who are being trafficked, who are with people who are not really their parents, then I think most kind, decent, honest people would become in favor of separating the children from the adults that they're with until we can do enough background checking to figure out what's actually going on.
Going back to the fiscal responsibility thing we were just talking about, I only brought up Hauser because in the 60 Minutes piece, Cecilia Vega mentions that Hauser told her that we are spending $150 a night to put these illegals in ICE detention. And they presented it like it was this exorbitant number. Oh my, the waste of it all. What they conveniently left out is that some of the stuff we've presented here in the past, we are putting migrants up in luxury hotels in Midtown Manhattan for up to $300 a night. So if they're saying it's so wasteful to spend $150 in ICE detention, they're doing, again, double that to keep them here.
Yeah, it's insanity. But here's the thing. I don't blame Hauser. He's a useful idiot. He made the mistake of trying to talk like he's an expert on things that he's not an expert on. It's like me going up to the Hill and waxing eloquent about military strategy and how to perform in close quarters combat. The fact is, I was never in the military, never been involved in those kind of things. So you know what? I don't talk about them. This is a guy who was never involved in immigration until Ali Mayorkas put him in some kind of position in immigration. And I don't think he was actually involved in immigration policy or the interpretation of immigration law. I think he was involved in either administration of the agency or something related to that. So these people get up there and they talk and they have no idea what they're talking about. So first of all, $150 detention cost per night is nothing. Where can you find a hotel in D.C. for less than $150? And then, as you just pointed out, the people on the other side of this issue were perfectly fine with giving these people $800-900 a night luxury hotel rooms in New York City when they thought they were going to be able to stay. But spending $150 a night of taxpayer money is too expensive. That does not make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. The math doesn't make any sense. And just the whole cognitive approach to it doesn't make any sense.
We also talked recently about the waste going on in those hotels. Remember that piece we saw about all the perfectly good food they were just throwing in the garbage because they didn't want it? And the fact that it's been reported that it's a deal where the government has made a deal with the owners of these hotels. They're guaranteeing them sellouts, basically, for this amount of money. And the hotel owners are just fine because they're making money off it too. So it's another scam, isn't it?
Well, it's another scam, but then what it does is it turns around and undermines all the tourist activities in New York City that are dependent upon people from out of town staying in hotels. So how much money did Broadway lose because, one, the streets aren't safe because they're crawling with Venezuelan gangs, and number two, because nobody could get a hotel room unless they went to, Uncle Bob's Flop House somewhere. And all of the nice hotels were filled with migrants. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And then the migrants aren't gracious. People who are seeking the American dream and who are coming here to work, raise a family, and do things the right way don't complain when somebody gives them free food and it's not the food that they want. And they don't complain when they're not getting the things they want out of the free luxury hotel rooms. I mean, you've got a family. What would you do if somebody said, hey, Brian, Orlando, you can have a free $500 a night room in a hotel plus free food? Would you complain? Well, I don't really like the color of the sheets in that room. The thread count's not high enough. And, cheeseburgers and pizza? I want macrobiotic food. I mean, this is silly. And the worst part of it to me is that you have people telling me that somehow, because these people showed up when I didn't ask them to, I am expected to tolerate behavior from them when they're not doing anything for the country. I'm supposed to tolerate behavior from them that I would never be expected to tolerate from a U.S. citizen or from a legal immigrant. And that's the other part of this that nobody talks about. This is undermining the legal immigrants. You have plenty of people who are legal immigrants who obeyed the rules and who came here lawfully to try and get away from a dangerous situation in their own countries. And what the media never tells you is that there are plenty of those people who have been going around to organizations like ours and to new media that's on the internet going, I don't want these people here. My neighborhood is not safe. And I come from the same place and speak the same language that they do. So it's this has been an attempt to pull the wool over the eyes of the American public, and it didn't work, which is why we got the election result that we did.
And on top of everything you just said, it's been reported that Tren de Aragua, which by now is setting up this criminal empire here in the United States, is using those hotels as recruiting ground to get more soldiers into their criminal enterprises. That doesn't happen at ICE detention facilities, right?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And if it does, it doesn't matter because you're going home. But the other piece of this is, and I think this is why it's beneficial that Tom Homan is in this position, you can deport all of these people, but if they just wander back over the border and you don't have consequences for that, okay, criminal reentry is a misdemeanor the first time you do it. It's a felony the second time you do it with a stiff sentence. If we don't start putting people in jail for that, which is what Trump tried to do with his zero tolerance policy initially, then we're going to have problems because people are just going to keep coming back. And when people talk about cost for this, fine, let's take a look at this from an economic perspective from the alien's point of view. There's a certain opportunity cost that you have to pay in order to get to the United States. If that's low, then you're going to engage, if you're an alien who wants to be here, in several, 4, 5, 6 tries in order to do this. And one of the ways that you keep people from doing this excuse me, and keep people from being hurt in the desert trying to get to the United States is you make the consequences more than those people are willing to pay in order to get here. But if you get here and you manage to cash in on a de facto amnesty or you get temporary protected status, which is never temporary, it's worth it because now you are making hard American currency. Even if you're living in public housing in a bad neighborhood, you're still living a better standard of life than you may have been in wherever you were because you have running water, you have heat, you have air conditioning, you have access to good medical care that the taxpayer pays for. So, coming here is worth the effort. And if you manage to put the stakes down and become the anchor for the rest of your family, then the benefit there is almost priceless. It is priceless. And people are going to continue to come here because of the type of nation that we are and because of the economic success we have, which is possible because of the type of nation we are. And we do not want to let our borders fall apart. Not only are you talking about criminal gangs that are developing and recruiting here, but there were Chinese males of military age that stood in formation and came to attention when they were caught by the Border Patrol. So if Tren de Aragua is getting here as a gang, then terrorist cells are getting here, and foreign intelligence services are getting here, and based on the Chinese coming to attention and saluting, foreign military formations are making their way in here. Tren de Aragua is scary, but those other two things are even scarier.
Since we're talking about New York City, there was a report in the New York Post this morning that said since Trump announced Tom as border czar, there's been a lot of enthusiasm among the NYPD rank and file about him coming in there. Yet they will not be allowed to assist ICE with removals because the city sanctuary policy forbids it. So you've got the police force wanting to help with this problem, but the absurdity of the city's leaders won't allow it.
Well, listen, the city has had the sanctuary policy since Ed Koch. And the fact is, and I know this because I worked on a couple of major federal task forces operating out of New York City when I was a trial attorney with ICE. All of these politicians were taking the really bad dudes, the really bad public safety problems and the national security problems, and they were shooing them out the back door with the help of federal government task forces, which had representatives from every law enforcement agency in the city of New York. That sanitation department, the sanitation department in New York has a police force because of the involvement of the mafia in waste trafficking in the 60s and 70s. And they have very well trained, very effective police department. We had detectives from the sanitation police on the federal task forces. And the bulk of what was being done by those federal task forces is finding foreign drug networks and foreign criminal enterprises that were working in the United States, arresting, trying, and convicting people involved with those, and then deporting them. And so there's a whole lot of hypocrisy going on in the sanctuary thing from the standpoint of New York City. And the other thing is, I think that the NYPD has been pushed to its limit. During the whole defund the police and the Antifa, BLM, and Black Bloc and all those other domestic terrorist organizations rioting in New York and elsewhere, the police felt that they were not being supported. They had a problem a few summers back with people. It became this viral internet thing for people in New York to sneak up with buckets of water and dump it on police officers. And, the city said, well, this is harmless. There's nothing we can really do about it. The police union was very upset. So I think that cumulatively you have reached a point where you may get police officers actually going, listen, this is a federal legal obligation. I don't care what the law in New York City says because it's illegal since it conflicts with the federal laws. And you're going to find them much more willing to help than they have been in the past because they know they can turn to the federal government. And instead of the civil government pursuing them and prosecuting them for a civil rights violation because they participated in a joint operation with ICE. I think what you're going to have is a Trump Justice Department going, oh, no, you can't fire this person. They were helping to enforce federal law. They didn't do anything that was unlawful or inappropriate. We'll see. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of resistance to all of this, but I think based on his last term in office, Trump is aware of what the other side's game is and how they're going to run it, and I think he's going in loaded for bear this time and with strategies in place to combat a lot of this stuff.
We talked about a lot of the big issues coming down the pike, like border wall and interior enforcement. What are some of the other issues? Because as we know, this is an incredibly complex issue, illegal immigration, immigration at large. What are some of the other issues that this incoming administration is going to have to tackle as part of its overall immigration strategy?
Well, it's going to have to deal with the human smuggling and trafficking routes the cartels have across Latin America, and that's going to mean some diplomatic interaction with other countries. They're going to have to deal with the fact that HHS managed to lose somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 children who are allegedly unaccompanied alien minors.
300,000.
300,000. And nobody has a solid number. That's the other scary part of it. At first it was 80,000, then I heard 300,000. This was under the Biden administration. This never happened under the Trump administration. And some of the children that were found after they were initially lost were found being trafficked by labor traffickers. One of them was like 8 or 10 years old, and they showed him in an industrial rubber suit at 3 o'clock in the morning cleaning equipment in a slaughterhouse with a pressure sprayer. I mean, it's... If you care about children, you do not want an 8 or a 10-year-old involved in that kind of stuff. There's the whole sex trafficking issues. There has been a huge amount of sex trafficking of adult women as well as children, male and female children. There's been fentanyl streaming into the country. I know that's a big issue for Tom Homan personally, and he's very upset that there have been 150,000 or more Americans who have overdosed on fentanyl. If you stop and look at the fentanyl issue, that's being driven by China, and China has a history going back to the Vietnam War of trying to get its enemies addicted to narcotics so that it undermines their military. I think what they're trying to do with the fentanyl that's coming into the United States is do the same thing on a society-wide level. There's myriad issues that all have to be dealt with at the same time. On the other hand, I think Trump's got a team that is more than capable of dealing with all of that stuff. And I think this time he's got a team that's capable of overcoming the opposition. I think the people who are going to oppose this are going to find themselves getting steamrolled.
As of right now, Trump has this incredible mandate based on the election results that the people are behind him to push forward with the things he's proposed. What's going to be interesting is to see how long the people will maintain that support in light of this withering propaganda campaign that the media is going to throw at the public to try to change their opinion on these things. And we know some of the tactics they employ. Like one of the things they love to do is they take the most sympathetic looking illegal person here and portray them as this victim of this cruel xenophobia that the government is laying on them. It's interesting that they're very selective in who they present like that. In that 60 Minutes piece, they did that exactly that. They found this woman in Baltimore with this family, this grandparents or parents, and crying, a lot of tears about how they might go back. There was no mention of or no attempt to interview the families of Jocelyn Nungare, Laken Riley, Rachel Morin. These victims are just forgotten, and they tell you, don't focus on them, only focus on what we present to you.
Yeah, it's a deliberate attempt to use sob stories to try and divert people's attention from the real issue. And, I would say, one, personal experience has taught me that most of the time the sob stories aren't. I think if you dig far enough on a lot of these stories that have been brought up in the paper as sob stories, you will find welfare fraud, you will find other government benefits fraud. The fact is that if you look at this like your house, if you come home and you find two people that you don't know in your basement and they say, well, really, we're just here to, to do nice things. We needed a drink of water. It's hot outside and we wanted to watch your large screen television. And, we clean the house. Are you going to call 911 or are you going to offer to pay for their college education and their health care for the rest of their lives? And every time that the left pulls this, it's like the DACA kids. Well, then everybody found out most of them weren't kids. A large number of them had gang affiliations. Very few of them did any of the things that were necessary to qualify for the program. USCIS was banging them in and approving their DACA applications, even though they had criminal convictions, hadn't graduated high school, all of these kinds of things. So this is very simple. This goes back to when Giuliani cleaned up New York City. They used the broken windows theory of policing. And that theory says that if you tolerate any kind of criminality, whether it be teenagers breaking windows in abandoned buildings or people urinating in public or being drunk stumbling around, that if you allow those things to go on, it fosters an environment of criminality and then you just get more criminality. And I think what Giuliani did with cleaning up New York City compared to what's been going on since Adams took over New York City is proof that that approach works. Trump started doing that approach to immigration. He started employing the zero tolerance policy where he was charging people with a crime for entering the United States. He ramped up deportations. He didn't tolerate illegal aliens doing things that are more illegal. So this all comes down to, if you're going to tolerate people breaking the law, then they're going to continue to break the law. And in 30 years of doing this, I have seen repeatedly that people who are in the United States in the shadows are much more willing to engage in criminal behavior if they start encountering difficult circumstances than regular people, because what do they have to lose? If they think that, the police are going to get them and they get released on some kind of no bail program, then they just beat feet home, wait a few years and come back here. And so this is a much bigger, more complex problem than the other side would have you believe. It's not just about, we need to hug the nice people and let them stay. The immigration laws exist for a reason. It's beneficial when people obey them. And the side of this the media never talks about is for every family like that woman in the 60 Minutes interview that came here illegally, there are families that have decided to obey the rules, which are waiting 15, 20, 30 years in India and the Philippines to get here because they played the game the way it should be played. Why are we going to punish those people by rewarding the people who break our laws and giving them TPS and paths to citizenship and approving their bogus asylum claims? I mean, it just, what it does is it undermines the system as a whole and encourages things to be lawless along the border. And as we have seen over the last 4 years, that lawlessness creeps from the border into the interior of the country.
So to wrap it up, Matt, given the resolve of Trump and the team he's assembling and what we know about the anti-borders opposition, how do you see this mass deportation going in the big picture?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's going to be a mass deportation. I think it's simply going to be America enforcing its immigration laws, and I think it's going to work. And I think what's going to happen is logistically, this is going to work like deportation has always worked in the 30 years that I've been doing this. The only difference is that you're going to see more of it. Instead of a once a month flight to the Dominican Republic and once every 2 months to Asia or Africa, you're going to see weekly flights going out to these places until order is restored.
Congratulations, you made it to the end of the podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the Immigration Reform Law Institute, go to irli.org. If you found this information useful and you'd like to support the show, go to irli.org/podcast. You can also hear this show on Apple Podcasts, Rumble, and Spotify. And don't forget to check us out on all the major social media platforms. Thanks again.